Blanke. Thank you for joining us on Voxafrica today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The African Development Bank Group has been praised in recent days for its response to curb COVID-19. Could you please tell us more about AFDB's overall response to curb COVID-19?
So we have recently come out with a $10 billion facility that is aiming to respond quickly to COVID. And without getting too much into the technical details, which are more our internal soup, I can tell you that it's a combination of grants and loans.
Okay.
Just from our different windows that we have at the bank. And we aim to do really three things with it. The first is to provide budget support to governments, again, through either loans or grants, so that they can deal with some of the big challenges that they're dealing with. So it supports their own programs. And we do that in coordination with the other multilateral donors, as well as bilateral donors, just because there's a lot of money that's flowing around right now, and just to make sure that we're not just doing things on our own. That's the first one. The second one is really looking at some specific emergency operations that are needed right now, especially in health, getting PPEs and, helping countries and regions, especially because we're taking a regional approach to get the right kind of, isolation facilities, tests, and things of that nature out quickly to try to stem the challenge. But also we're looking at food issues, because we don't want an economic and social crisis to spill over into a food crisis. So looking at ways to get seed and fertilizer very quickly out to farms so that we don't miss the planting season. And so those are those two. And this is all more sort of public sector, or working with regional institutions, working with, say, the WHO, and other international institutions. And then the final window, which is a lot smaller, just because the nature of what's happening right now requires a lot of government intervention. But we do have private sector clients, and we know that some of them are really suffering. And by definition, the fact that we're working with them means that they're doing good things for development, that they have additionality to development processes in different ways. And so we have some of the funds that will be going to viable companies that are already our clients to support them through sort of liquidity support in this challenging time. So that sort of gives you an idea of what we're doing, both in terms of issues and how we're approaching the issue. And I would just add to that I think probably the most interesting thing about this is that development banks are not very fast necessarily all the time. So what we've tried to do is to really shorten the processing times of the work that we're doing, working together with our board. And so working hand in hand with the board, just trying to get things out as quickly as possible, because this is indeed a crisis.
How will the people in rural areas see the improvements in their daily lives?
Just COVID, or in general?
COVID and in general.
Okay. Well, in general, I think everything that we do is really aimed at supporting livelihoods, lives across many different areas that we work in. But the truth of the matter is that countries all around Africa, as around the world, have lockdown. And so there are really big challenges. And so, some of the things that we're doing, and I'll give you an example from the emergency efforts that are going out, and together with the WHO, just making sure that people have testing centers, people know where to go, kind of taking the stress level down, making sure that there's masks, that there's, hand sanitizer, and the things that they need on a day-to-day basis. And so these are the sorts of things that they see. But working with the governments, and I think this is very important, some of the things we're supporting going forward are, for example, support of family budget support in a way, monthly funds that will go out, payments that will go out to families to make sure that they continue to at least tread water until we get out of this challenge. So it really does have an impact on people's day-to-day lives. And, although, as a development bank, really our goal is more to be providing livelihoods over time. But what we're trying to do right now, and what people are seeing through COVID response is really just the short-term measures to make sure, just like everywhere, that people are able to get through this crisis so that we have a post-crisis to work with.
In addition to the AFDB, many governments, international financial institutions actors from the private sectors have been able to mount impressive emergency responses to curb COVID-19. Meanwhile, a deadly flood left thousands homeless in Kenya, and a second wave of locusts threatens the country's food supply. Do you think that Africa and the world have lost sight of climate change threats while battling against the COVID-19?
I think the world probably is pretty focused right now on climate change just because they're noticing how much it improves things on that side, when we're traveling less. We have carbon emissions that have gone down. You're starting to be able to see the Himalayas, things that were not possible before. In Africa, it's true that we're sort of dealing with a short-term crisis, but you can't forget about climate change in Africa. It's everywhere we look. It's all around us. And you mentioned the locust. One of the emergency operations we went out with that isn't necessarily COVID was to help different organizations go out and do the spraying and things that are necessary so that the next wave is not going to eat all of the crops. Last year we were sort of lucky because they came after the harvest. This time they could come before. And so we know that if we don't deal with that now, we're going to have a big challenge. More generally, even in everything that I'm looking at that we're rolling out on the food security side of things, all of it is about climate smart agriculture. You have to think climate smart agriculture in Africa. There's no point of doing anything else. So in the seeds that I'm talking about that we're rolling out, for example, it can be, heat resistant wheat, things that we have growing in places like Sudan and Ethiopia making a huge difference, or drought resistant maize in places like Zimbabwe, Zambia, that can withstand some of these crises, because we know that crises come and go. We know that drought comes and goes. We know that sometimes it's quite difficult. It's going to get hotter, and so this is something that we're focusing on a lot at the African Development Bank. I agree. Probably the world needs to be focusing even more, but in Africa we can't afford to ever stop thinking about climate.
Dr. Blanke, in 2016, the AFDB launched Feed Africa, a strategy for agricultural transformation with specific goals to be reached by 2025. Do you think that these goals could be reached at the moment? And do you now see the continent as having enough food supplies for the intra-African trade, especially when we take into perspective the effects of climate changes in crops and livestock viabilities?
Well, if you look at Africa, Africa is importing way too much food. This is just a reality, and it's getting worse. So we're almost importing net something like $50 billion worth of food every year. And unfortunately, it's the processed food that we're buying while we're exporting, basic products that are just, sort of dug out of the ground or picked. And, this is something that we know needs to change. Because we have a high and rising, middle class, or a growing middle class. We have high and rising urbanization, and the demand is getting higher. By some estimates, it's going to be above $100 billion, dollars in the next 5 years or so if we don't change things. So right now, there's a bit of a challenge. However, the African Development Bank has been working on this a lot, also with all of our partners, the CG centers, the international agriculture research centers, to make sure that we find the best possible crops, seed, and get it out to farmers at scale. This is a key part of Feed Africa. And I mentioned some of them just a moment ago in terms of heat resistant crops and so on and so forth, also highly nutritious crops. And these are going to be very, very important for Africa going forward. We're already seeing pretty impressive changes. However, it's not just about growing. After you have a windfall, because this is about Africa's green revolution, you still need to transform that into processed foods, that people want. Not all of it, but a decent amount of it. And again, we're working on special agro-industrial processing zones that we can have in the rural areas. You were asking about rural areas before, that will create employment, that will create revenue generation. It's a huge challenge right now, but it's a massive opportunity. There's no doubt that COVID is going to slow things down, but we're doing everything we can to make sure it doesn't stop. And I think going forward, one other thing I would just add, and this is something that many different actors are talking about, which is green corridors. making sure that you don't stop trade in Africa just because you're closing borders to keep people safe. African countries have been very good about, most African countries anyway, have done quite a good job about slowing the speed of the health crisis. But we need to make sure that food still gets where it needs to go, and that we continue enhancing trans-African trade or inter-African trade so that, again, a crisis doesn't become a food crisis.
With widespread lockdowns delivering a major hit to domestic economies, what are your thoughts on the post-COVID-19 impact on Africa's economy? What challenges and opportunities, if any, for intra-African trade?
Well, look, anytime that you slow an economy down, you're going to have an impact. And the African Development Bank has made estimates in the range of 20 billion to 80 billion as a hit from COVID. It really depends on how quickly we're able to get back to normal. But I really see this as a reset. We've had a chance to step back and think about what works and doesn't work. And a lot of the challenges that Africa is facing, it was facing before. And now it's just even more, clear. And so, my sense is that there's this accelerated desire to fix things. I think health systems definitely will get a lot more support after this. And so, that will be hugely important, I think, for human capital development in Africa. And I would just, we talk a lot about infrastructure. That's extremely important. But I would focus as well on education. If we come out of this crisis improving educational systems with the young people in Africa, there's a huge opportunity afterwards to grow. If we do all of the things that we're talking about, so my hope is, as a development economist and as an eternal optimist, is that everybody is sort of taking this experience and we will come out of it faster. And people, that people are raring to work, right? But what we need to do is transform a lot of those jobs from informal jobs to formal jobs, and that's a big effort. And, coming back to your question on trade, that's a huge part of the solution. Delighted that the CFTA has been finally, really, it's getting into force, and we're actually providing some support as they get up to speed. Obviously, things again have been slowed down, but African countries have an intention of working together. There's no doubt that 54 countries, many of them small, need to work together if you're going to have a platform that you can then use in order to really have thriving industries which create those jobs. And my sense is that Africa is going in the right direction, and my hope is that there's going to be this pent-up energy after what we've gone through, and with all of the support we've given to make sure we don't have a crash. It'll be difficult, no doubt. I talked about how much we'll lose, and that we'll get back up to the levels we had before, and hopefully this will be much more inclusive growth as we go forward.
The president of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, recently said that these are extraordinary times, and we must take bold and decisive actions to save and protect millions of lives in Africa. We are in a race to save lives. No country will be left behind. Do you think that he was only referring to lives taken by COVID-19 or lives taken by any diseases at all, especially malaria, which remains the leading cause of death in Africa?
I think he was thinking beyond just health, right? Because it's having a huge impact now. You mentioned malaria. By some estimates, and this is based on what they saw happen in areas that were affected by Ebola a number of years ago, that malaria numbers could double. And that would be catastrophic because we know it's such a huge killer in Africa. And so, no, we are not thinking that it's only about coronavirus and dealing with that. It's very much about shoring up health systems that we see are not working very well, but not only health systems, people can also die from hunger or despair, and so, this is why, and just economies need to function. So when the president was speaking, certainly he was thinking about coronavirus, because you get scared when you see the numbers and you think, gosh, every death is one death too many. But, it's very much about all of the work that we're doing across the health sector, but also across, food, energy, all of the things that we need to get to countries so that they can function well, and that we can ensure that you don't have a societal crisis where you just have a total collapse.
Dr. Blanke, what are your thoughts on the broader approach to reducing infectious diseases and overcoming risk of future progress, such as unemployment, inequality, and vulnerability on our continent, Africa?
Reducing infection, look, I think, again, going back to that, I think that the countries have dealt with this quite well, because they've had experiences of infectious diseases, HIV, AIDS in many parts of Africa, Ebola in other parts. I can tell you that here, the rollout of things like hand washing stations, people wearing masks, a cottage industry of masks showing up, people are very disciplined. And I think that there is an experience in Africa that's quite good. However, this cannot only be left to people's responsibility. And so, for example, there's the Center for Disease Control for Africa that's really growing and taking a lead on some of these issues. We're actually, one of the projects that we're developing under the facility that I was talking about is going to be providing funding to, well, as long as it gets approved by our board, we'll be providing some funding to the CDC. And these things, I think we need to take an African approach as well. But I have to say I've been pretty impressed with what African countries have done. I would just say there's one other aspect I would bring in, because this is always a balance between saving lives and not destroying economies, right? I mean, every country in the world is pretty much facing this challenge right now. And so what we need to do is to think about, what do you do in a place like Africa with a large informal economy? And you've had very different approaches, as we know. Again, looking at Cote d'Ivoire and a number of the countries in the region, closing down the formal economy, shutting borders, making sure that you keep, the population sort of stable, and then letting the informal economy work to a certain extent, so that people who are living on a couple of dollars a day can at least go out and make some money to feed their families. This seems to be working better than in some places that we're maybe locking down more, and we have to wait and see in the end what the results will be. But indeed, this, going back to what my president was saying, is also about making sure that every life matters, and it's lives lost through different ways.
What is the most urgent thing Africa should be doing now to address the underlying uncertainty of the COVID-19?
I think that Africa needs to be testing a lot more, and it's expensive and it's a challenge. And we have to find a way to do some sort of track and trace, even if it's something that won't be as advanced as in some of the rich countries. But otherwise, it's going to be very hard to make sure that everybody's confident to get the economies going again. And when I say testing, I mean obviously testing for the disease itself, but also antibody testing and just following what's going on globally. Luckily, Africa actually has so far been suffering less from these sorts of things than some other countries, and has learned a lot, I think, from some of the experiences elsewhere. And so we just need to keep learning, and we need to keep moving fast. But for me, probably testing while shoring up the health systems over the longer term will really be critical.
This is a time when resilience and creativity is tested at all levels. What is your personal experience? Any positive takeaway from this lockdown?
Yeah, well, my positive takeaway in general, when I think about the future, and I was talking about a reset, I really have faith in young people in Africa to get us out of this crisis. Not only by themselves, governments have a huge role to play, businesses have a huge role to play, but Africa is a very young continent. And there's so much energy in the young people here. They see challenges everywhere, and those challenges are opportunities. So, if we can, they need finance, they need decent education so that they have the capacities. But, it seems to me that when you kind of link that together with the huge changes that we're seeing, for example, telemedicine, fourth industrial revolution, in Africa, we sort of skipped fixed line telephones, went to mobile phone. And then, kind of skipped bank, actual physical bank structures everywhere, and instead went straight to mobile banking. Now, let's see some leapfrogging when it comes to things like telemedicine, because you might not have doctors everywhere, but you could have access to them. And young people are going to be a huge part of finding those solutions. We did a hackathon recently. We're going to be coming out with some of the winners in a couple of weeks, because we're assessing. But we got young people working together and saying, what would you do to make a difference in COVID. And we had some pretty interesting responses and impressive responses. And those who win will get some funding and also different kinds of support. And I'm putting my bet on the young people. That's what I'm most hopeful for.
Youth is the future. That's a brilliant initiative. Thank you for your time and insights, Dr. Jennifer Blanke. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.